So right now we're going to be talking about the difference between autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs are any type of living thing that makes its own food, and usually this is done through photosynthesis. Animals are heterotrophic, that means that they have to ingest the food in order to get energy, and they do this through something called cell respiration. So photosynthesis is used by plants, and cell respiration is used by animals. For photosynthesis, what this actually is the conversion of light energy into chemical energy used by autotrophs. So, in layman's terms, that just means that we're taking the energy from the sun's photons and we're transforming that energy into cell fuel, basically, energy that the cell can use. So, this is the chemical equation that's used to describe what actually happens in photosynthesis. The CO2 represents carbon dioxide. The H2O represents water. The C6H12O6, that represents sugar or glucose, and O2 represents oxygen. So on this side of the reaction, you have your reactants, and on this side of the reaction, you have your products. The only way that you can transform these reactants into these products is if you have light. So without light, this reaction can't happen. And without any one of these reactants, the reaction also can't happen. So the plant gets its carbon dioxide through the little holes at the bottom of the leaves, and the carbon dioxide is found in the atmosphere. And then water is obviously found from the roots of the plant, and so they absorb all the moisture in the soil. It goes up their root system and goes down into their stems and leaves. The sugar that's created is the energy that the cell uses in order to make all of its cell processes happen, and then oxygen is given off as a byproduct, and that's what basically drives cell respiration. So if you take a closer look into a plant cell. So here's your plant cell. You have these green structures called chloroplasts, and inside them there's chlorophyll, and the chlorophyll is the green thing that makes plants green. So if you take a closer look at the chloroplast, you'll see that there's these tiny round discs that are green, and they're called thylakoids. They are what hold the chlorophyll, the green stuff. And when you stack all the thylakoids up on top of each other, it makes something called a granum. So here's a granum here, and here's a granum here. When the two grana are connected, they're connected by something called the stroma lamellae, and you'll see that function later. You have the outer membrane of the chloroplast, the inner membrane of the chloroplast, and the space that's inside of the chloroplast is called the stroma. So we can take a closer look at what's happening inside the chloroplast, inside of the granum, the actual chemical reaction that happens. So here, this is a granum, it's a stack of thylakoids, and you can see entering from the left are photons. These are the yellow particles that are entering the picture. So when a photon enters, what it does is it hits water molecules. So these are little H2O molecules that are coming up into the plant. They came there from the roots. And as the photon hits, you see that it transforms the molecule. So it goes from being a water molecule to suddenly being a molecule of oxygen. That's the double blue molecule that's coming up here. So that's O2. And you can also see that the little hydrogens, the little red balls here, the hydrogens, and they get hit by a photon, they separate and they go over into the stroma lamellae. So once the little red hydrogens get basically kind of kicked off of the H2O molecule, they go into the stroma lamellae where they recombine with carbon dioxide. So you can see carbon dioxide coming from the right here. The carbon dioxide is combining with the hydrogen molecules, and it's making more oxygen, which you see leaving from the top, and then you see carbohydrate leaving from the bottom. That's glucose. That's what the cell needs in order to basically make its processes go. So again, all that's happening is the light comes in, it initiates the reaction, the water turns into oxygen and hydrogen molecules, and the hydrogen later combines with the CO2 to make sugar and more oxygen. Okay, so that's everything that happens inside of the chloroplast. Now we're going to look at what happens inside of an animal cell. So the previous slides were all about plant cells. Now we're going to talk about animal cells and how animals basically develop a kind of cell fuel to make their cells run. So this process is called cell respiration in animals. So we convert stored energy, which is the sugar, and we make cell fuel, which is known as ATP. So if you notice anything different between this reaction and the one you just saw, it's just backwards. So if we look at the other reaction from the chloroplast, which was right here, it started with carbon dioxide and water. This one starts with sugar and oxygen. So the reactions are basically flipped over. And so we call these processes reciprocal processes because one leads to the other happening. You can't really have cell respiration happening without having photosynthesis happening because in order for cell respiration to happen, you need the products from the previous reaction, from the photosynthesis reaction. So all you need to understand from this slide is that there's 3 stages to cell respiration: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport. And in each of these stages, you have a certain amount of cell fuel that's made. So we represent cell fuel by ATP. And you can see in this picture here that from the 3 stages, altogether, 38 units of cell fuel, or ATP, is made from one sugar molecule. So one sugar or glucose molecule makes 38 units of cell fuel. So it's pretty efficient if you can take 1 unit of glucose and turn it into a lot of cell fuel. So the organelle that's responsible for doing this is called the mitochondria. So in the plant, it was the chloroplast that was responsible for creating the energy for the cell. In the animal cell, it's the mitochondria. So you have 4 structures here. You have the inner membrane, you have the outer membrane, you have the cristae, which are the little folds here in the inner membrane, and then you have the matrix, which is the fluid or liquid that's floating around inside. So it's important to have all these little folds because if they weren't there and the inner membrane was just flat, then you'd have a certain amount of chemical reactions happening. The cristae, these little folds, that's where all the glucose reactions happen that turn into cell fuel and make ATP. So this reaction right here, this chemical reaction, it happens inside of the little folds. So the more surface area you have of these folds, then the more this liquid, the matrix, can react with the cristae, and that's what actually makes the reaction occur. So the more cristae, the more reactions, and then the more ATP you can get. So it's important that this inner membrane is folded and not just flat. So again, the reason why we call these 2 processes complementary processes are because they're basically opposites of one another. Okay, this reaction is this reaction flipped over. So if you see here carbon dioxide and water plus light, this is photosynthesis, and you should be able to recognize that. And this one here is taking sugar or carbohydrates and adding oxygen. If you think about animals, we take in a lot of sugar through our foods, and we also breathe in oxygen. So these things together, we release carbon dioxide, and we make water as a byproduct too. So they're complementary processes because the products of this one here, which is photosynthesis, the products here end up being the reactants in this reaction, so one can't happen without the other. And then the same here. Carbon dioxide and water are the products here, and they end up being the reactants of the other reaction.